Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Hello, and thank you for joining us on this special edition of Newsmakers. I'm Michael Hernandez, in for Fred Martino. First a New York Times bestseller, then an Oscar award-winning film, Black Klansman tells the story of how former police detective Ron Stallworth infiltrated the ranks of the Ku Klux Klan. Stallworth recently visited New Mexico State University to share his experiences in front of a full house. Take a look.
There is the card. Signed by David Duke, the idiot.
Retired police officer Ron Stallworth still keeps his red membership card from the Ku Klux Klan in his wallet for show, and for good reason. As the first black detective in the Colorado Springs Police Department, Stallworth infiltrated the KKK in the late 1970s. He details his time undercover in his 2014 memoir, Black Klansman. Director Spike Lee adapted his story for the Oscar award-winning Black Klansman movie. Stallworth recently visited New Mexico State University to share his story. He grew up in El Paso in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. Stallworth ranks his experiences then as positive. El Paso, he says, insulated him from the events taking place in the Deep South.
The burnings, the killings, everything that was going on at that time was a reality TV show for us on the 5 and 10 o'clock news. And for that, I'm very grateful because I was able to experience a part of history, not necessarily at the forefront, because we weren't, but I could witness it along with my classmates, and we could see what was happening in America, how America was being torn apart because of racism and such.
As the book and movie explain, Detective Stallworth responded over the phone to a newspaper ad recruiting new Klan members.
If you're going to be something that you're not, you have to fit in with the people that you're interacting with. And so I assumed the persona on the phone as a white supremacist by using the language of hate. It was that simple.
This is Ron Stallworth calling.
Well, who am I speaking with?
This is David Duke.
Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. That David Duke?
God. Last time I checked. What can I do you for?
Well, since you asked, I hate blacks.
An officer for more than 30 years, Stallworth initially joined the police force to pay for college and earn a degree as a PE teacher. After his rookie year, he was making twice as much money and having as much fun. But the mystique of the narcotics officer Stallworth first encountered fascinated him and spurred him to be a narc himself.
They were very scruffy looking. We called them hippies. Very long hair, long beards. They just didn't fit in with the police environment. And yet they were cops in every sense of the word. And I liked the fact that you could look that way and still have the authority of the badge to do the job.
With that badge comes inherent risk, but Stallworth says he felt no special danger as a black officer.
We were liked by some, hated by many, and if anything, the black community as a whole was not very welcoming to me and others, simply because we were black. They viewed us as traitors, the enemy. And that is a dichotomy that black officers in this country find themselves in. As I say in my book, we are too black for the white community and too blue, as in the uniform, for the black community.
That's especially salient in the era of Black Lives Matter and the Blue Lives Matter counter-movement. Citing an increase in far-right extremism, Stallworth says attitudes on race have taken a giant leap backwards under President Trump.
Trump, for all intents and purposes, is the ideological leader of the white supremacy movement in America. Trump is a disgrace to the office that Barack Obama held so honorably. Trump advocates on behalf of white supremacy individuals. He did not denounce David Duke. He did not denounce the violence in Charlottesville. he made the most ridiculous statement that there were good people on both sides.
On both sides.
For the record, there's no such thing as a good Nazi. There's no such thing as a good skinhead. There's no such thing as a good Ku Klux Klan member. There's no such thing as a good alt-right member. They're white supremacists, period.
For Stallworth, who is working on a new book, El Paso will always be home. He says he loves the diversity the city offers, whether that's the people, culture, or cuisine.
I love that diversity. I don't need to be in a city that is predominantly black in order to find my cultural roots and heritage and to feel as one with others. I feel as one with the people of El Paso, and I love where I'm at.
And Stallworth says who he is.
Say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud. Say it for OJ, Jimmy. You too. Say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud. Say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud. That's right. There it is. I believed you.
Here now is Ron Stallworth. He'll be joining us for the rest of the half hour. Ron, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
So you joined the Colorado Springs Police Department in the early 70s as a cadet. Besides thinking that the narcotics officers were cool, the hippies, was there something specific that changed your mind for good to want to become a cop?
I wanted to become a cop, as your interview said, because I wanted to go to college. I wanted to earn money, put myself through college, be a high school PE teacher. And after a year of being on the job, I was making twice as much money as a recent college graduate in the teaching profession, and I was having too much fun. So I just stuck it out for the next 32 years.
Did you feel like you were a pioneer at the time, being the first black detective in the police force? Did you feel like your book, you actually, parallel yourself to Jackie Robinson a little bit, but did you think you were a pioneer at the time for other minorities to join the force?
Well, I didn't parallel myself to Jackie. The city personnel manager, James Woods of Colorado Springs, he's the one that made the comparison.
That's right.
And at the time, I did not feel like I was setting any historical marker whatsoever. I was just a young black kid who wanted a job, and this was the road, the path that I was taking. It wasn't until much later that I realized that some people saw it as something significant.
How did your other coworkers, how did they accept you once you were actually, once you actually became a cop? What was that environment like?
It was kind of tight, kind of rough initially, because they were not accustomed to dealing with quote unquote decent black people. The people in the Colorado Springs Police Department at that time were more accustomed to dealing with the people, the blacks on the street, the pimps, the prostitutes, the dope dealers, those type of individuals. And when I walked in through the door and they started having dealings with me, they were still talking around me the way they did around the others. I heard a lot of so-called N-word jokes, a term I don't like, by the way. I heard a lot of N-word jokes right in front of me as if I wasn't there. I heard a lot of Polish jokes where they would take the Polish aspect out and put a N-word person in. You know, how many Poles does it take to screw in a light bulb? Change that, how many N-word? I heard a lot of that. And because I was on probation, I had to take it for a year. On the 366th day, I didn't take it anymore.
You grew up in El Paso, as we saw in the video, at the height of the civil rights movement. In the book, you talk about one day in particular, April 4th, 1968. How did the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. impact you as a freshman at Stephen F. Austin High School in El Paso?
It was a very eerie moment to get the announcement over the PA system that the assassination had taken place. We were dismissed from school and told to go immediately home. Nobody knew what was going to unfold at that moment. We later found out that some cities started rioting and looting and burning. We didn't know what was going to happen in El Paso, so we were told to go straight home. I went to the house of a guy who lived on the block that I did, me and another, And we sat there, and he had a reel-to-reel tape. And we listened to Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. We listened to it about 3 or 4 times. And as we listened, all 3 of us discussed amongst ourselves, where were we going to go as a race of people now that Dr. King was gone? What was going to happen to us? How far back were we going to be set? Were we going to literally have to fight a race war in America? These were the questions that were going through our heads as freshmen and sophomore kids. And it was a very unsettling moment for me personally anyway.
Sure, it must have been very unsettling. And we know racists can be found everywhere and anywhere. But specifically, how did the level of racism in Colorado, a state in the Mountain West, how did that compare with the racism that you experienced in a southern state like Texas? From growing up to adult.
Racism is racism. No matter where you are, it's the same ugly face. The biggest difference in Colorado Springs and El Paso was, in El Paso, you had Hispanics in the mix, for obvious reasons.
Right.
In Colorado Springs, they weren't so prevalent. They were there, but they weren't so prevalent. It was, for all intents and purposes, it was very close to being a lily white environment in Colorado Springs. And the racism was not subtle. What that was expressed towards me, it was not subtle in any way, shape, or form. And again, I'm a 19-year-old kid. I had to learn to deal with that within the boundaries of my restrictions, being on probation for a year. I had to learn how to deal with that. I had to learn how to overcome that. And I had to learn how to literally triumph over it.
I want to talk about your career for just a minute. There's a part in the book where you have the ability to look through FBI files regarding the history of the Klan in Colorado. What went through your mind as you were digging through this time capsule that dated all the way back to the 1920s?
I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This was a part of history that was not known to the average person. I was literally looking at ghosts from a bygone era. Ghosts of people who had affected the environment, the society, some for the better, a good number for the worse. And to realize that this had happened literally in my backyard of Colorado Springs and the surrounding area, Denver. It was very unsettling to realize that this history was out there, but no one knew about it. And I wanted so badly to make copies of some of this stuff, but I had strict orders not to make copies, just take notes. So I took as many notes as I could for later reference, and it was made clear to me by the FBI agent I was dealing with that you didn't see this. In other words, it doesn't exist.
And that's strange in and of itself that you're allowed to take notes, but notes are copies themselves. So it just, the semantics of it all, that's something I found a little bit fascinating.
Well, he knew me, and it was an agreement, a gentleman's agreement, professional agreement, that nothing would become of it other than I would have a reference point that I could use.
Sure. Without
saying where it came from. And I honored that agreement.
In your book, you also talk about how the media back then in the late 1970s, how they were quick to give the KKK a platform, how they were quick to give Klan members a voice whenever they asked for an interview. How has the news changed when it comes to giving extremists a voice?
It really hasn't. No criticism of you, but you gentlemen in the media and ladies are in many respects complicit in the spread of people like David Duke, knuckleheads like Donald Trump, because you recognize what their message is, but you make it newsworthy and give them a platform. a platform they don't need. I cite in my book how the Klan would hold a rally, a march, and when they saw the media, they would put their robes on, go tell the media, do you want to interview? The media would say, yes, meet me around the corner or a block away, and the media would meet them, and then at 10 o'clock at night, 6 o'clock at night, I'd see that interview. If the media had said, not interested, you're a racist, go on about your business. But they don't do that because you all are looking for the scoop. And in that sense, you become complicit in furthering their cause. And it still goes on today.
And for the 6 and 10 o'clock news, it sounds like that's more geared toward the commercial stations, but it happens probably in all outlets of media as well.
I'm sure it does.
What conversation did you have, if you can tell me a little bit about the conversation that you had with David Duke when he asked you about how he was going to be portrayed in the movie? What was that like?
It was a very surreal moment for my wife and I to be in a Brooklyn hotel, and my cell phone rings, and I answer it, and the voice says, Ron. I said, hi, David, how are you doing? I recognized his voice like 40 years had never passed.
And this is the first time that you had spoken to him since
in 40
you
years.
had finished the investigation?
In 40 years, yeah. And he basically was calling because he had seen the trailer for the movie in which Topher Grace portraying him was depicted. And he was concerned about how his image was going to appear once the whole movie came out a week later. And he was trying to influence me to influence Spike Lee to change some things. I had no influence with Spike Lee, but this was why he called, and we held an hour-long conversation on a variety of topics dealing with racism, his hatred for Jews, Donald Trump, white supremacy, bigotry. He insisted he wasn't a bigot or a white supremacist. We had a nice chat about that. He insisted Donald Trump wasn't a racist or a bigoted. We had an even further chat about that. And it just went on and on.
It seems a little funny that the leader of, or at least the former leader of the KKK, is worried about his image, at least when it came to the movie or the book.
You have to remember, David Duke is a politician. He ran his faction of the Ku Klux Klan as it was trying to gain a political base 40 years ago. And I always tell people in my lectures, what David Duke was preaching 40 years ago, Donald Trump preached in 2015 running for president. He used David Duke's playbook for all intents and purposes and got elected. And David Duke was a politician. He won the Louisiana House of Representatives.
Which he ran, he failed to win twice before running as a Democrat, but once he switched over to Republican?
Correct. And he switched over because he said that the Republican Party was closer in ideology and philosophy to him than the Democratic Party. And it proved to be true.
For context, do you remember what year this was?
I want to say it was around 1984, somewhere around there.
Okay.
But that proved to be true because where Democratic voters rejected his politics of aggrievement like Trump ran on, Republican voters accepted it. And they didn't care about his racist background or anything else, his bigotry. They accepted him, and he won. He tried to go further in his political career and never had any luck, but he did win that office, and he's still out there politicking now.
While we're still on the topic of Charlottesville, both the book and the movie revisit the violence that took place there. Were you surprised by Trump's comments or the fact that David Duke showed up? Did that surprise you in any way at all, or?
Was I surprised by Trump's comments? I was surprised that a person in his position could be so dumb, so stupid, to make the dumbest, most ridiculous remark that could be made in light of what had happened.
You're referring to good people on both sides, that
Correct.
comment?
I couldn't believe that I was hearing that coming out of his mouth. As I said in your previous interview with me, there are no good Nazis. There are no good KKK people, skinheads, alt-right. They are white supremacists. There are no good white supremacists. And yet he was endorsing and acknowledging it.
How does the extremism of today, a la what took place in Charlottesville, how does that compare to your days as a cop, the cross burnings that you were successful in preventing, but also just the fear that that was part of that environment?
The extremism of today is far more extreme than it was back in my day.
How so?
Charlottesville is a classic example. They are very brazen, they're very blatant in their racism, in their extremist outlook. They don't care today. Back then, they weren't so upfront about it. They tried to keep it concealed a little bit. David Duke even tried that. You know, that's why he didn't wear a white robe in public. That's why he didn't go around in public saying the N-word. He did in private. He did with me on the phone. But it was all designed to conceal what was obvious. Today, they're right out front and they don't care.
There's also, you also mentioned that they didn't refer to themselves as the KKK. They were the organization as well. That also sounds like it plays into what you're talking about as trying to reform their image a little bit.
They refer to themselves as the organization or the cause.
The cause.
And we chuckled about it, but that's the terms that they used.
How happy were you with the movie's take on your story?
I was very happy. We went into this knowing Hollywood was going to play a little bit with it. They always do. And I only asked that they not show cops in a ridiculous light, to be as true to the profession as they possibly could. For the most part, they were, and I applaud Spike Lee for that.
How much of a say did you have in that process?
None.
None? Not a single thing?
No.
For winning Best Adapted Screenplay, you had no role in any of that?
No. My wife and I were there for the cast read-through, the very first time the cast came together. And we talked to the actors. They exchanged numbers with us, and they contacted us over the succeeding months as they were filming periodically. But I had no input in terms of consultation or anything like that, no.
Were there any changes between the book and the movie that you objected to?
No.
In terms of plot? Okay.
No. I knew what changes were going to be there. I might add, the end version of the movie was not the same version that we read at that cast read-through. It underwent probably one or two more revisions before the movie itself came out. So we knew where some of the changes were going to be, additions and so forth, but it was spiked up even a little bit more.
Spiked up?
No pun intended.
Pardon the pun. So your investigation, it exposed federal officials from NORAD as Klan members, and also prevented cross burnings from taking place during the time of that investigation. How do you look back on what you were able to accomplish?
We accomplished a great deal, considering it was strictly an intelligence investigation, not a criminal one. We did expose the two NORAD people, top security clearance at NORAD, got them removed. We identified the white supremacy network in Colorado, something which had not been done up to that point. We identified the tentacles. We prevented 3 cross burnings, 2 directly because I was invited to participate. Mm-hmm. The third one, based on the outcome of the first 2 failures, they just decided not to have it. And we were able to prevent. I'm very proud of the fact that nobody in Colorado Springs ever woke up to the sight of a burning cross. Nobody. Being a military base, there's a lot of people from the South in the military. I'm glad that the community as a whole didn't have to experience that, but especially the white citizens of the military who had that history behind them. In police work, we are accustomed to thinking inside the box, where a success is dependent upon how many arrests are made, how much drugs are seized, how much contraband as a whole are recovered.
A numbers game.
It's a numbers game. This investigation was not like that. I can tell you definitively that this whole investigation cost probably $150.
$150.
That's what we spent.
In late 1970s money.
That's what we spent. The most expensive thing we paid for was the membership, which was $30 a month for 2 people. And we bought a couple of T-shirts for the 2 guys that were posing as my avatar. And then the rest was drinks and a meal here or there.
We have just 1 minute left, but I want to wrap up with, what do you hope people take away from your story?
I hope people will realize that racism is alive and prevalent. It never goes away. When people say the KKK is not viable anymore, which I've heard from some of my police friends, I always laugh at that, because you may not hear about them, but they are there. They're always there. They go underground. Sometimes they're above ground. They just are very dormant. But they are racist. They're white supremacists, and that never goes away. Always be vigilant.
Ron, I want to thank you again for your time. It's been a pleasure having you here to share your story. Ron Stallworth is the author of Black Klansman, Race Hate, and the Undercover Investigation of a Lifetime. And we want to thank you for being with us for this special episode of Newsmakers. I'm Michael Hernandez. We'll see you next time. Have a great night.